Hello and welcome to Sharing Vietnam on VTC10 and Vietnam On Nhận. Vietnam is one of the most vulnerable countries in the world to the climate change impacts. While taking most of the agriculture-related works in the family, women do not get a chance to approach and access to the climate change-related issues, knowledge, and practices as compared to men. So in our program today, we have a talk to Ms. Elizabeth Cowan, Country Program Advisor, to talk about the topic of supporting Vietnamese women farmers in coping with the climate change. Thank you, Ms. Elizabeth, for joining our program today. Well, first of all, how do you evaluate the general situation of the climate change in Vietnam, especially the rural areas?
Vietnam, like every country in the world, is being affected by climate change. Climate change is happening now and we're all affected. I think for Vietnam, given the diverse geography of the country, climate change is impacting different areas differently. So for example, in the Mekong Delta, we're seeing increasing incidences of floods, whereas in the northern mountainous regions, there's more droughts happening, so kind of two extremes there. Of course, for rural areas, people experience the impacts a lot more extreme than in urban areas, given their dependence on agricultural livelihoods, which are very vulnerable to changes in the climate.
Okay, so what should we do to integrate this general sensitiveness in climate change in Vietnam, and why is it so important?
Women and men in Vietnam occupy different roles, and these impact on how they are able to adapt to climate change and also how they're able to be resilient to climate change. Men, who are traditionally seen as being responsible for providing for their families, whereas for women who have much less voice, they're not able to participate as much in decision making within the household or at the community level. Their needs are often not heard in the development of plans that respond to climate change, which makes women more vulnerable. So in Vietnam, it's very important to support both women and men to be able to adapt to climate change, but often we need to do more work for women because they are more vulnerable.
From your and your organization's experiences, what are the key points to target the gender in climate change issues in Vietnam?
One of the main things is supporting women's leadership and women's participation.
Yes.
So getting women involved in planning, making sure that they are able to voice up their priorities and have their needs put into those plans so that when disasters hit or when the weather patterns change, their needs are being met. The things that make women more vulnerable to climate change also make them more vulnerable to poverty, for example. So in the ethnic minority communities where care works, we support women to have access to things like credit, training, skills building, and have the opportunity to participate in decision-making forums. These things are good for development in general, but something like accessing credit also helps them to diversify their livelihoods, which makes them less vulnerable to climate change.
What are the differences if we involve the role of women in the climate change coping activities and the disaster reduction activities?
So sometimes in the development of community-based adaptation plans at the community level, for example, if you take a traditional approach, just go in and do a consultation without thinking about gender, usually you'll end up in the meeting where there's a lot of men, very few women, and men are mainly doing the talking. So in that situation, is it really a community plan or is it a men's plan? So we make special efforts to engage women, and therefore that plan will actually be more effective and more appropriate for responding to the community's whole needs. But also because women and men have different responsibilities in the household and in the community, by supporting women and men to work together, it actually can enable them to support each other, which makes them more resilient to stresses in weather patterns and disasters, and can ultimately lead to happier communities.